Arthrodesis of the CMC-1 joint with the CMC-I fusion system, 2.0 tri-lock plate and CCS 3.0, by Richard Gelberman, Washington University, US. Exposure. An incision is made from the junction of the middle and distal thirds of the thumb metacarpal, dorsally, to the radioscaphoid joint proximally. We isolated the branches of the superficial radial nerve and protected them. We isolated the radial artery beneath the outcroppers and protected it. We then made an incision along the dorsal thumb metacarpal, across the basal joint to the STT joint. We cleaned the thumb metacarpal, elevated it and then isolated the trapezium and placed a retractor into the triscaphoid joint. Preparing the joint surfaces. Elevate the capsule from the base of the thumb metacarpal. Use a rongeur to denude it of all cartilage, get down to the subchondral bone. Remove any ridges. Work on the distal aspect of the trapezium, all the way down to the deep surface. Once that's done, check the coaptation of the metacarpal to the distal aspect of the trapezium. Fashion with a rongeur the dorsum of the trapezium for later application of the plate. Remove any residual prominences from the base of the thumb metacarpal, check any prominence on the lateral aspect of the metacarpal. On the trapezium there are usually little ridges that need to be flattened out a bit. Obtain cancellous bone graft from the dorsum of the radius. The dorsal radius tubercle is palpated and marked 3 to 4 cm incision along the dorsum of the distal radius. The dorsal radiotubercle is isolated. We routinely use bone graft for basal joint fusion. It can be obtained from the dorsal, through the second dorsal compartment, or from the volar aspect of the radius, as you prefer. Bone graft is obtained. Wound is later closed. Positioning and prefixation of the plate. This is the thumb basal fusion plate. It's anatomically designed with a 10-degree bend at the proximal aspect to better conform to the trapezium metacarpal space. It's designed to lie on the trapezium with the initial application to the trapezium, with subsequent application to the thumb metacarpal. At this point, use the fluoroscope to check and make certain that the contours are as needed to obtain fusion. After confirming satisfactory position by fluoroscopy, the radial hole is drilled into the trapezium. A depth gauge is used, and it is not essential to penetrate the opposite cortex. A tri-lock locking screw, in this case, 18 mm, is used. It is not locked at this point, is carried down to the plate, but not locked. Bone alignment and temporary transfixation with K-wire. After placement of the bone graft in the trapezium metacarpal space, a 1.1 mm K-wire is inserted either through the trapezium into the metacarpal or, as shown here, from the metacarpal to the trapezium. At this point, we have the option of removing this K-wire and rotating the plate so it best copes to the thumb metacarpal. The position of the thumb should be aligned with the middle phalanx of the index finger. So this position is ideal. Fixation of the plate on the trapezium. The other screw hole in the proximal portion of the plate, over the trapezium, is addressed. Assign the screw length using the depth gauge. A 14 mm tri-lock screw is chosen. This can securely be placed into the trapezium by locking it. The lateral screw may now also be locked into the trapezium. Prefixation of the plate on the metacarpal. An olive K wire may be utilized to secure the plate to the metacarpal. After insertion of the olive K wire, the distal screws in the plate, the compression screws, are inserted into the metacarpal. The drill guide is marked with the eccentric symbol to allow compression. The arrow has to point toward the fusion site. The distal aspect of the hole is drilled. Depth gauge is used to assign length of the cortical screw. This screw is not locking. Insert the cortical screws partially into the drilled hole. The olive K wire may be removed before or after the partial insertion of the cortical screw in the other compression screw hole. Compressing with the cortical screws. The K wire transfixing the metacarpal to the trapezium is removed. Completely tighten both cortical screws to apply compression. Inserting the guide wire for the CCS. Next, attention is directed toward the base of the trapezium for insertion of the CCS compression screw. The trapezium metacarpal joint is palpated and the position for the drill is isolated. Protect the radial artery. It is important to only deviate the wrist on a bump. It's far easier to insert the compression screw with the hand resting in ulnar deviation. Assigning the length of the CCS. Depth gauge is used to assign the length of your CCS compression screw. Select a screw that is slightly shorter than the length determined above to allow for shortening through compression of the fusion gap. Usually 2 to 4 mm shorter. Inserting the CCS and applying additional compression. A protection sleeve can be used to cover the screw for insertion. It automatically retracts as you insert the screw. The screw is placed over the guide wire. Radial artery is protected, and the CCS compression screw is inserted from the trapezium into the thumb metacarpal. The screw is inserted until the thread of the screw head contacts the cortical shell of the trapezium. At this point, untighten the 2 cortical screws at the distal part of the plate by 1/4 to 1/2 turn to allow additional compression from the CCS compression screw. The compression screw is completely inserted into the trapezium, such that the head is buried beneath the cortical surface. The cortical screws are fully tightened and the guide wire is removed from the trapezium. On the lateral X-ray, we see that the CCS compression screw is in the appropriate position and that the compression has been achieved across the trapezium metacarpal space. The postero-anterior X-ray demonstrates that the trapezium metacarpal spaces is nicely aligned. Fixation of the plate on the metacarpal. The last step is to drill and insert 2 tri-lock screws bicortically into the middle portion of the plate above the proximal thumb metacarpal. X-ray number 1, the lateral X-ray shows that the plate is well coated to the thumb metacarpal. The proximal tri-lock screws are not penetrating into the trapezium metacarpal space or the triscaphoid joint. The CCS compression screw extends to the opposite cortex of the thumb metacarpal. X-ray number 2. The postero-anterior X-ray shows that the tri-scaphoid joint is clear and that there are no screws extending across that joint. X-ray number 3. The trapezio-trapezoid joint is also visualized to be certain that there are no screws extending across that interval. Wound closure. The capsule is closed across the trapezio-metacarpal space. Soft tissue is approximated directly over the plate and the skin is closed with sutures.